So officially, good evening, everyone. Tonight, this Bible study will be, as I titled it, the study of the man Joab, part two. And if you saw my message, my reminder message, uh, the day before, yesterday, early morning, I was hoping to make this just a two-part study and complete it this evening, but as I worked on it, I could see that was not possible. So, what I'm going to do is just launch into this part two. We'll cover as much as we can this evening. And I want to begin by a recap of what we covered in part one a month ago or 4 weeks ago regarding this man Joab. If you recall, Mr. Lamori asked me if I would be willing to do a Bible study focused on Joab. And I quickly agreed to that. I've been somewhat intrigued, I'll use that word, by this man for a long time. I think I mentioned last time, his name is mentioned 146 times in the Bible. So he's not really an obscure person, and yet not a person that we focus on very often. If you recall, then, in the first study, we defined him as an enigma. And when that word, enigma, is applied to a person, here's the best succinct definition, quote, one with a confusing mixture of qualities that seem to be in opposition to one another. And I think that's certainly descriptive of Joab. Remember, too, that he was the son of Zeruiah, and Zeruiah is not a man. We almost always assume in the Bible, son of, and then that whomever uh, this person would be the son of, would be the father. But in this case, Zeruiah was his mother. We have no idea who his father was. But just as important as that is the fact that Zeruiah was David's sister. And hence, Joab is a nephew to David. He's part of the extended family. Seems about the same age. And we'll see that at the very end of this series of studies. You know a little bit about him. We defined he's a bold, or was a bold, decisive man. He had natural leadership qualities, and that seems to be a trend in that family. He served as general of the army in most of David's reign, not in the entirety of his reign, but most of it. And as I was continuing to study this time, it jumped out at me there is no record in the Bible that he ever lost a battle. That's rather remarkable. Now, he may have, but the Bible contains no record that Joab ever lost a battle when he was general of the army. He was one who was quick to take vengeance. And one example of that was when he killed Abner, who was Saul's general. That was in that period of time when uh, David, Saul had been killed, but a good part of Israel, particularly the northern tribes, had remained loyal to Saul. And Abner was essentially leader there, although one of Saul's sons was king. But I guess, in a sense, Joab took care of that issue because he killed Abner, which was not David's intent. And he did that partly out of vengeance because Abner in battle had killed Joab's youngest brother, Asahel. And so there is a matter of, according to the Old Covenant law, the avenger of blood. But Joab really didn't handle it that way. And I'm not going to go back over that tonight. Joab did understand that God is in charge. And remember once when they were preparing for battle, and this is back in 2 Samuel 10. And I won't go back there, but I'm going to quote to you some of the words we looked at last time. As they were preparing for battle, Joab said this to the army. Let us be strong for our people and the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what is pleasing in his sight. So Joab recognizes they are the people of God, And the battle is the Lord's. We find that phrase in the Bible also. But Joab understood that. Remember too that he also, I would say, in a noble way, backed away from claiming the victory after a prolonged battle to take Rabbah. Rabbah was a city of Ammon. And essentially, they had completed the task of overcoming that city, but David was not there. And so Joab backed away and he asks David to come and complete the victory and then consequently claim the honor of victory. And David did that. Joab is not entirely a bad person. I really want to emphasize that again. There were good qualities in Joab. We have to understand that. Now, he had character flaws as well. David, and in more than one place, and we discussed that a little bit after the study last time, David, on more than one occasion, said, "These sons of Zeruiah are too much for me." And depending on translation, it may say too strong for me, too hard for me, too harsh for me. But I think we get the picture. They were hard to control. And David himself was a very strong leader. So when someone like David says that, we get the picture. These guys were men of action, and sometimes they tended to act on impulse and not always following orders uh, to the nth degree. Yet it's very clear that David needed Joab, and he allowed him to serve again during most of his reign. He did have good qualities. So I want to immediately go into part two tonight. We broke off in 2 Samuel chapter 12 last time, and there's no mention of Joab whatsoever in the next chapter in 2 Samuel 13. What is recorded in that chapter? And I did ask all of you to read ahead because there's no way I can cover all of this. And again, the study is focused on Joab, not on David and the other events that were going on at that time, although they're so intertwined. Um, we can't ignore that either. Even though there's no mention of Joab in 2 Samuel 13, some things that happen later occur because of what's recorded there. In that chapter, we have the almost immediate trouble that arose within David's house. And right now, I'd like to share my screen with you regarding David's house. Let me just quickly bring up something here. I want to bring up a PowerPoint. Uh, Here we go. I hope you're seeing this. What it's showing, just briefly, the family of David. That's simply a title screen. Now, I'm not sure. Of course, some of you don't have video, but the family of David, if you go back, and this graphic is kind of busy, and I understand that. It comes right out of our UCG Bible commentary. But I put on the right, what it's showing is from Boaz and Ruth, Obed is born. Next in line, from Obed, Jesse is born. And from Jesse, we had David, and I abbreviated it on the right side, David et al. That means David and others. But at the bottom, if you can actually see the graphic, here are Jesse's 7 sons and 2 daughters. Eliab was the oldest, and then it moves on across. All of David's 6 older brothers are listed. Then next, by the way, the blue triangles, if you can see that, are all men. They are sons, or in this case, brothers to David. The 2 red circles are his sisters. The first one is Zeruiah, older than David. Then David next, and then finally Abigail. And depending on how far I can get tonight, we're going to talk about who she was, because again, there's a real connection here, and we're going to find David turning to someone in that family as well. Let me go to the next slide. I put the names over here, Jesse's family, not critically important, but a little easier to see. And again, the two in red, if you can see that, Zariah and Abigail are sisters. The rest are the six older brothers and then David. Now, this slide is really busy, and I know that, but this chart is really cluttered, but it shows 8 wives of David by name. 8 wives by name. Depending on how large your screen is, if you have a computer or if you're showing this on a TV, perhaps you can read it. For those of you who don't have a video, across the top here, David's wives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, ending with Bathsheba. By the way, beginning with Michal or Michal, who was Saul's daughter, his first wife, then clear across Bathsheba. But notice another red dot. It says other wives. So we've got 8 of them named, but then other wives referenced in Scripture. And beyond that, yet another red dot, concubines. And I don't think I'll go into a detailed description, but concubines were wives, but they were wives of low social status. I've sometimes defined them as servant wives, but nevertheless, they were wives. So from these first, actually, Michal had no children, but the next 7, or the next 6 wives, rather, bear 6 sons to David, and they're named in Scripture. Then Bathsheba ultimately, beginning with Solomon, bears 4 sons. Actually, there would be a fifth, the little baby that was born from their act of adultery. But of course, that little boy lived, we presume, but a few days. Then move over the other wives. A daughter is born there too, Tamar. And then look at this, 9 more sons. If you're counting, there are 20 sons here, but it says he had other sons too, this other sons. And I have a reason for going through this. When Nathan pronounced punishment on David from the Lord, and I put the scripture on the screen, 2 Samuel 12, verses 10 and 11, and we talked about that briefly last time. When Nathan pronounced actually the Lord's punishment on David for that act of adultery, and then worse yet, the murder of Uriah, he said, "The sword will never depart from your house." And he said, "I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and his or your own wives will be taken and publicly violated." Now, that was actually 10 of the concubines. So we see this the sword never departing and adversity from within David's own house. We see that beginning to happen immediately. This was a very large household from which a lot of trouble would come. And so this is the family environment in which David lived, but it also had an impact on Joab as he served the king. And that's my reason for going through this. Again, the study is not about David, but I just wanted you to show you and expand your understanding if you hadn't studied that before. First of all, of how big David's household was, and then the fact that, God has said, the sword will never depart. Trouble, adversity is going to arise within your house, your own. And of course, there was a fourth punishment. That happened immediately. The little boy died. So let me continue. Going back to 2 Samuel 13, this trouble and adversity within his house, it's the very next thing that happens. And in chapter 13, we have a terrible story of what the oldest son, Amnon, did. It says he loved his sister Tamar. Now, Tamar was a half sister. He didn't love her. He lusted after his half sister, which was wrong, comes up with this plot because a cousin, I believe it was, helped him out with hatching up this plot to feign, or in other words, pretend that he was sick. And he asks, actually, David, his father, to send Tamar to him. He Again, he wants to be comforted because he pretends to be ill, that she would bake some special cakes for him and present them to him, feed him, and somehow that was going to make him better. Well, I think you know, if you read that, or if you didn't get around to reading it, you may remember from memory what happened. He orders everyone out of the house, so it's only he and the lady Tamar there. He asks her to bring the food into his bedroom, and all that is a ruse to get her to come to his bed. Uh, he simply wants to have sexual relations with her. She refuses. It then turns into rape. To put it bluntly, that's what happened. Tamar is now defiled. She flees back to the home of Absalom. Absalom is her full brother and a half brother to Amnon. When I said she flees, actually, Amnon turned on her, orders her out of the house, and of course, she's overcome with grief. That leads to Absalom also taking vengeance. Adversity arose within David's house, and ultimately the sword came to David's house because if you read that closely, after 2 years, Absalom it's during the time of shearing sheep. Yeah, that was actually a time of celebration in ancient Israel. And so he invites all of the brothers to come up to where he's shearing sheep. He even invited David, but David didn't go. And there again, he's got a plan. When he gives a signal, he asked his men to fall on Amnon and murder him. That's exactly what happened. David is very angry with Absalom. First, he's very angry with Amnon after the rape of a half sister, but he didn't do anything about it. Well, Absalom did. But now David is very angry with Absalom. And so Absalom flees into exile up in Geshur, which is northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Today, that would be a reasonably short drive there in Israel. But at that time, that had a significant distance. And so he feels safe up there. And the king up there is actually his grandfather, and he gives him safe haven for 3 years. But David's anger subsides, and he now yearns for Absalom. And we'll talk about that here a little bit in a moment as we get back into the next chapter. But our Beyond Today Bible commentary has some very straightforward, but rather painful comments about the environment in which David's family grew up. David had 6 sons by 6 wives in 7.5 years. So all these boys are coming along, and they needed a father, but David was away at war for a significant amount of time. Plus, you know, he is the king. He has to administer all the affairs of the country. And so it appears like he was not all that involved in his children's upbringing. And then there's another issue, and our commentary again is blunt about that. His own adultery, his own act of adultery had become a very bad example for his sons. So one can be righteous, and David was, and still have some big problems to work on. And these things also have an impact on others. Now, let's go to our Bibles, because now let's get to Joab, the real focus of the study. After everything that happened in chapter 13, if you have your Bible open now to 2 Samuel 14, I might call your attention to the last verse of chapter 13, which is verse 39. It says, King David longed to go to Absalom. for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. David comes to accept this, and maybe he realizes he should have taken action with Amnon after that grievous sin of rape, but he didn't. So he comes to grips with it, and now he longs for Absalom. Chapter 14, verse 1. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. Some translations say Joab perceives that David longed for Absalom. That's what the Majority Standard Bible says. So he hatches a plan to hopefully bring about reconciliation. Let's read on, verse 2. And Joab sent to Tekoa. This is kind of an elaborate plan. Tekoa is not next door, so to speak, to Jerusalem, but he sends there and brought from there a wise woman. Now, the Hebrew word from which this word wise is translated in English can also mean um, skilled or even cunning. So he brings this woman into the plot. He says to her, middle of verse 2, please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead. And that was the custom of the time. And so he's telling her, this is what you do. Now, verse 3, he even tells her what to say. Verse 3, go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. So he gave her her lines to memorize, if you will. So I'll move quickly here. Verses 4 through 17 have a fairly lengthy account of how she presented herself as a poor widow. We'll skim this. In verse 4, this woman spoke to the king. That's David. She fell on her face to the ground, prostrated herself, and said, help, O king. And so again, she's got a pretty good act here. She's in distress. The king said to her, what troubles you? And she said, well, indeed, I'm a widow. Verse 6, now your maidservant had two sons, and the two fought with each other in the field, and there was no one to part them, but the one struck the other and killed him. It's a pretty clever story here. None of this happened, but this is what Joab told her to relate to David. Verse 7, and now the whole family has risen up against me, or against your maidservant, and they said, deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother whom he killed, and we will destroy the heir also. And then she says, so they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the earth. Now notice David's reaction. It's a little bit like when Nathan came to him with the story of the traveler, and the wealthy man is going to entertain him, and instead of killing one of his many sheep, he instead went and took a sheep from the poor man, the only lamb that he had. I think you remember that story. There's a little bit of a parallel here. The king said to the woman, verse 8, go to your house, and I'll give orders concerning you. And the woman says to him, my lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and my house. But notice verse 10, the king said, whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore. So he's offering absolute protection here, that her last living son will not be taken from her as well. And she said, please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. Now, that was part of the old covenant law, the avenger of blood. But notice he assures her again. He said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Now, I'm going to pause just a moment, because when we get to verse 12, the next verse, this story shifts a little. She now becomes bold. But again, Joab had put her up to all of this. But notice how the shift occurs here, verse 12. Therefore the woman said, please let your maidservant speak another word to my lord the king. And he said, say on. In other words, she said, I want to say some more here. And he said, go ahead. Verse 13. So the woman said, why then? Notice this really shifts. Why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring his banished one home again. So she's turned the tables here. Now she said, I'm really talking about you. You've got a son out there who killed another, but you're not bringing him back. Verse 14, for we will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground. So, in other words, we've only got so much time to make things right. Middle of the verse, yet God does not take away a life, but he devises means so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. So she's really saying, you need to figure out something to rectify this situation, because that's what God would do. Verse 15, now therefore I have come to speak of this thing to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your maidservant said, I will now speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the inheritance of God. And then verse 17, your maidservant said, the word of my lord the king will now be comforting, for as the angel of God, so is my lord the king in discerning good and evil, and may the Lord your God be with you. So now she's saying, I know you're going to do the right thing, and you're going to take action here to restore your son back to you. Okay, the story shifts again. By the way, before I go on in the scripture, I want to read another quote from our Beyond Today Bible commentary, which says, quote, the scriptures tell us that it is always best to resolve our differences and not let them drag on. There is no other way out. If an offense occurs, both parties should seek settlement and reconciliation. One of David's major faults was that of not addressing family problems head on. Our own Bible commentary has some rather blunt uh, lessons from this, but I do know it's true. David also was not a perfect man, even though he was a man of good character and, as we know, a man after God's own heart. But he had his weaknesses. So, verse 18, this gets interesting as well. Then the king answered and said to the woman, please do not hide from me anything that I ask you. And the woman said, please let my lord the king speak. Go ahead, ask me. And verse 19, I find this very interesting. So the king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? David is a very sharp, if I could put it that way, wise and discerning man. And he's figuring out something's going on here. Is the hand of Joab with you in all this? And the woman answered, notice what she said, as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. For your servant Joab commanded me, and he put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant to bring about the change of affairs. Your servant Joab has done this thing, but my Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of the angel of God, to know everything that is in the earth. She must have been a little taken aback when David confronts her and says, okay, did Joab put you up to this? And she acknowledges that he did. But this isn't wrong. This is not wrong. Joab is trying to be an agent of reconciliation here. Why did he use the woman instead of going directly to David? I don't know. You know, there's always, or many times here, there's a backstory we love to know, and it's just not there. I thought about when David was in exile and Saul was trying to kill him. And remember when David had threatened to eliminate every male out of the house of Nabal? Remember that? And who intervened? A woman, his wife, Abigail, and she came to David and David actually said, if you hadn't come, I'll just really condense the story. If you hadn't come, there wouldn't have been one male member of your household alive by morning. And maybe Joab remembered that and said, maybe a woman can break through and get to David. I don't know. That's only my conjecture. Now, in verse 21, we see what happens. It seems like this is immediate. And the king said to Joab, in the meantime, Joab comes on the scene. He summons him, or however this happened. Joab was probably nearby. The king said to Joab, all right, I have granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom. Joab's reaction is very interesting. In verse 22, he fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight. O king, let me keep the flow. I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, and that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant. So it's really Joab that wants this. Verse 13, it seems like this was immediate again. Joab arose and he went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. Verse 24 catches us a little bit by surprise. And the king said, let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house, but did not see the king's face. David does not permit, he tells Joab, okay, go get the young man, bring him back here, but he will not allow him even, a simple audience. It's hard. Commentaries have various things on this. Was David still upset about what Absalom had done? One bad event leading to another bad event. It's just hard to know. I'm not going to say too much because I couldn't come up with anything real conclusive on this. I will say that I don't feel Joab had any selfish motive for this. The scripture doesn't support that. There is some thought that Absalom was a personal friend of Joab's, but I think later actions are going to cast a lot of doubt on that. I feel personally Joab was simply trying to be, as I said earlier, an agent of reconciliation. In this troubled household, he wanted to see if he could bring about some good. Now, let's go to verse 28. Skip ahead a little bit. Verse 28, staying in chapter 14. And Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem. So remember, after Amnon raped his sister, the 2 years expired, if you read that, before Absalom killed Amnon. Now, that put him in exile for 3 years, and I didn't cover all of this. That's 5. And now it's 2 more. It is 7 full years since all of these events played out. And Absalom, again, he's still in Jerusalem, verse 28, but he did not see the king's face. At no time in these 2 years was he allowed to see his father. So he pleads in verse 29. Well, it doesn't say plead here, but he says, therefore, Absalom sent for Joab. And I think that would be natural. Joab was the one who was used to bring him back to Jerusalem. So he sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. Verse 30, so he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. What a household here. And that's what happened. Absalom's servants did that, and in verse 31, Joab is back on the scene. He arose and he came to Absalom's house, and he said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? And Absalom answered Joab, look, I sent to you saying, come here so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now, therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me. That's a pretty brave statement. He said, if I really done something wrong here, then my father can execute me. In verse 33, Joab went to the king and told him. So maybe Joab's a, well, I'm not going to comment about that because, again, it would just be my comment. Oh, but again, Joab now decides to intervene once again on behalf of Absalom. Next sentence in verse 33, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. Then the king kissed Absalom. That was a sign of acceptance and reconciliation. So finally, after this long period of time, Absalom comes into the king's presence, and it seems like David has really had a change of heart now. He not only allows him to come and see him, he kisses him. And if you care to study that a little more, that was quite significant. And now Absalom is back in good standing, if you will. He's back in the household, back in David's favor. There's no mention of Joab again until chapter 17. In chapters 15 and 16, what happens there is another very, very sad story. Absalom becomes filled with pride. He was a very handsome man. And if you read ahead, as I asked, there was no blemish in him, it says, from head to toe. That's pretty remarkable. He was a guy that people would probably see, wow, there's in modern parlance, maybe there's a movie star. But that's only part of the problem. With great subtlety, he sets himself up as a capable judge who would grant justice to anyone who came to him if only he had the authority to do it. Now, that's a somewhat lengthy story, but I hope you read that. He was telling people, well, there's just nobody to plead your cause, but oh, if I were just made a judge here in the country, I would see to it that you would get justice. And he says, and this phrase is a quote, he stole the hearts of the people. That's in 2 Samuel 15, verse 6. And he became prominent in the country. Prominent enough, eventually. We don't know how much time played out here, but prominent enough that he felt he could pull off a coup and he could take the throne. And it's interesting, David, again, did not, you would assume he might call for Joab, listen, I've had it, go out and quell the rebellion, but he did not. David and those who remain loyal to him had to flee the capital. It's such a sad story, isn't it? David recognizes Absalom has gotten not everybody, but he's gotten perhaps the majority, and we could presume that the majority of the nation on his side, and David realizes he's in jeopardy. So again, he and those who remain loyal to him flee the capital, and it leads to, I think this was very brief. Maybe there was only one real battle, but it leads to a civil war within the nation in which the army, most of which appear to remain loyal to Absalom, end up fighting with those who remain loyal to David. Now, because the Bible study is about him. Next mention of Joab is out in chapter 17, and it's clear on into the latter part of that chapter. It's in verse 25. In 2 Samuel 17, verse 25, now this is just mentioned. Joab isn't doing anything here, but I want to point something out here. In verse 25, and Absalom made Amasa captain of the army instead of Joab. Now, Joab has gone with David. We're going to see that here in a moment. But notice who Amasa is. This Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jethro, an Israelite who had gone into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So once again, in this, you've got a blood connection here, and these men must all have skills, certainly military skills. And so who does Absalom turn to? Can't turn to Joab, but he finds another relative who this would be a cousin to Joab, and puts him in charge now of the army in Israel. Now let's go to direct mention of Joab. That's in chapter 18. And let's just begin in verse 1, 2 Samuel 18, verse 1. And David numbered the people who were with him, and he set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. So it's not like the entire nation has defected to Absalom. He's got enough here that he's got captains of thousands, plural, and hundreds. Verse 2, then David sent out 1/3 of the people. He divides up this army that is still loyal to him. So he sends out 1/3 of those people under the hand of Joab. Joab is mentioned first. 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. Here we are again. This family really has, if nothing else, they have skill in battle, but more than that, these people are strategists. And then the last third, are under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. So he's going to lead them into battle, but the people answer, don't go. Let's just skim this. If we flee away, they won't care about us. Nor if half of us die, they're not going to care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are no more help to us in the city. In other words, don't go. He's really after you. And King David acknowledges their wishes. Verse 4, he said, whatever seems best to you, I will do. And so he remains. Something very important in verse 5. This involves Joab. Verse 5, now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. So he didn't call them aside. He didn't call the leaders aside. Clearly, this was a public directive, if you will, at least heard by the public, those that were immediately around. Because again, note that all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. And that order was, you deal gently with him for my sake. So they go out to the battle. Verse 6. The people went out into the field of battle against Israel. And the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. This would be up in the northeast part of actually a part of Judea there. And the people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So this was a very, very bad day. And it's all a result again of the trouble, the adversity that arose in David's household, which Nathan had prophesied, if you will, and the fact the sword would never depart from his house. But here it starts to impact the whole nation. It's a very sad story. It was a day of slaughter. I want to read something from Barnes' notes on the verses we just read. Barnes' notes has an interesting commentary, and I'll quote it. The battle was scattered. Probably Absalom's forces were far more numerous than David's. And now note this next statement. But most likely by Joab's skillful generalship. The field of battle was such that numbers didn't matter, and David's veteran troops were able to destroy Absalom's rabble. In other words, this ragtag detail. And then continuing the quote, the wood entangled them and was perhaps full of pits, precipices, and morasses. And other commentaries also speculate that's how the woods took out more people, or at least removed them from the battle, than actually died on the battlefield. It was a real day of slaughter. All right, here's a story that many people, I think, know and remember from the Bible, and that begins in verse 9. Verse 9. Then Absalom met the servants of David. So finally, they're coming face to face. And combat in that era was, in very close quarters. As far as they could sling a spear, or sometimes hand to hand with swords. So they're coming head to head, if you will. Continuing that verse, Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth, so that he was left hanging between heaven and earth. Now, just an aside here, this whole thing about heaven. And you and I, the people of God, are privileged to know this whole thing of going to heaven, this far off place. The whole concept is wrong anyway, but we talk about three heavens, don't we? Well, the first heaven, if you will, it's just right here, just above our heads. This couldn't have been over 10 feet off the ground, but I better keep moving. That's a side point, but that's the first part of heaven, if you will. He was left hanging in the air. Now, continuing. And the mule, which was under him, went on. The mule just kept going, and Absalom is hanging there. Can you picture that? I don't want to dwell on this too long, but remember reading, those of you that read what I asked you to read in between, remember his hair, which he only cut once a year? And one commentary says when he cut it, it weighed about 6 pounds. Our own Beyond Today commentary says about 5 pounds. It depends on the weight you assign to the shekel, but he perhaps had this huge, I don't know how to describe it, this huge amount of hair that snagged in this terebinth tree. So here he is hanging. Now, verse 10 involves Joab. Now, a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. And Joab's immediate reaction, verse 11, is he said to the man who told him, you just saw him? And why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. And maybe he would have. But this man is noble. He's not named in Scripture, but he's very noble. In verse 12, the man said to Joab, Though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. Why? For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. And this it gives us a little more understanding of what David instructed them. Don't you harm him. Verse 13, otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. In other words, you wouldn't have defended me if I had done that. That's a pretty bold thing to say to Joab, who was not a patient guy. But let's keep going. Verse 14, then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. In other words, I haven't got time to talk about this. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart. I studied this just a little bit, even today. 3 spears in the New King James. The original King James says 3 darts. And, in our mind, that brings up a image of something shorter and smaller, a dart. And that's probably a more accurate translation. Maybe just of wood, but maybe of metal. We don't know. But he took these darts, continue reading with me, and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst or hanging from this terebinth tree. And verse 15 adds something, and 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So he was probably going to die already from what Joab did, putting 3 darts into Absalom's heart. But 10 more young men, the armor bearers, if I could put it this way, finish him off. And in verse 16, so Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. Joab commanded respect. What he said, people tended to do. And it does show his leadership qualities, but unfortunately, this was an act of disobedience in taking Absalom's life. So they bury Absalom. Let me skim ahead, see if I can get through, sort of complete this story. Verse 19, Ahimaaz or Hamaz, the son of Zadok. Now he's the son of the priest, said, let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. In other words, some other time you can go with a message, but today you shall take no news because the king's son is dead. And then Joab said to the Cushite, he turns to another person here and he says, go tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. Something that is interesting about this, just a minute, I got to flip the page on my notes. The king has to be notified, of course, of the outcome of the battle. Joab again is clearly in charge, and he assigns this Cushite to go. Now, from the F.B. Meyer commentary, it says Ahimaaz was far famed for his swift running. He had already served that royal cause, and his family was intimate with the king, and that's true. Zadok was the priest, very loyal to David and close to David. Joab, this is now quoting the commentary, was therefore unwilling to entrust the youth with tidings which must give the king bitter sorrow, and perhaps cause him to associate them ever after with the bearer. Perhaps Joab also feared that the part which he himself had taken in Absalom's death would be exposed by Ahimaaz. The tidings were therefore entrusted to an Ethiopian slave. and that's another name for the Cushite, an Ethiopian slave. So if we skim ahead quickly, and Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, again pleads, verse 22 with Joab, whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. And, Joab tries to hold him back. Verse 23, he's really persistent. He says, but whatever happens, he said, let me run. So finally, he just says, run. But Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and he outran the Cushite, and he gets there first. And David is sitting between the two gates. The watchmen are up on the roof, over the gate to the wall. And so the watchman lifts his eyes, and he sees this man running alone. In verse 25, the watchman cries out, and he told the king. And the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. He perceives this is a messenger, this is a runner. And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running. And so, of course, this is the Cushite. He ends up being the second one coming. He said, another man is running alone. The king said, he also brings news. And the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. He had a real reputation. And the king said, he's a good man and comes with good news. So in verse 28, he called out, and he says to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king, and he said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. The very first thing on David's mind is in verse 29. The king said, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answers quickly, when Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. Is he hedging, or does he honestly not know? Well, I'm not sure, but he doesn't reveal anything to David other than the battle has been won. So the king says, verse 30, well, turn aside, you step aside and stand here. So he turned aside and he waits. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king. For the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you. And notice the very first question then, after hearing the news from King David in verse 32, is the young man Absalom safe? And the Cushite beats around the bush, but he says, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. And it becomes very clear to David, Absalom is dead. Verse 33, then the king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate, and he cries, he weeps. As he went, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son. That's a very moving portion of scripture. David is actually saying, I wished I had died instead of my son, even the son who had rebelled against him and had turned the whole nation against him. I'm going to have to stop there for sake of time. Joab, this is one of the, Joab gets some gold stars, if I could put it that way, in these accounts, but he also gets some black stars. And here's one of the black stars on his chart. Why did Joab disregard David's orders? I don't know. What was going through his mind? Was he fed up with Absalom's rebellion after all he had done to bring about reconciliation between David and his father? Was he simply angry over the outright rebellion of Absalom? We don't know, but what we know absolutely for sure is he disobeyed the king in this case, and Absalom paid the price, and he's dead. I'll stop there for this evening, and we'll resume immediately in chapter 19 and the final part 3 of this study. In the meantime, before I cut off, for those who will see this later, At first, I thought, well, everybody's tired. It's a busy time of the year. I wasn't going to put out any discussion questions. And then I had a change of heart. Said, well, let's at least discuss something. So here's what I put out. We know that Joab and David are nephew and uncle. They're quite closely related, and families often have strong common characteristics, both good and bad. So, knowing this, number one, from what we've studied so far, in what ways are or were David and Joab alike? I think you could come up with a number of things. But then on the flip side, in what ways are they different? And again, I think we can have some good discussion on this. With that, I'll complete the study for this evening and stop the recording. For those of you who eventually hear this later via recording, I hope you find it profitable.